The letter from the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before opening it that Sharon Whitley had found something new to complain about. I was right. I stood in my kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hand, reading the most ridiculous directive I'd encountered in my 15 years as a snow removal contractor in Boulder, Colorado. The HOA had decided, in their infinite wisdom, that snow removal operations within Pine Ridge could only occur between the hours of 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening. No early morning plowing, no late night clearing. Just a nice, convenient 9 to 5 schedule that showed they understood absolutely nothing about how snow removal actually worked. My name is Robert Ortiz, and I own Mountain Peak Snow Services, the largest snow removal company in Boulder County. I'd been servicing Pine Ridge and 3 other HOA communities for over a decade, and this was the first time anyone had tried to tell me when I could clear snow. The irony wasn't lost on me that Sharon, the HOA president who'd signed this letter, had been the loudest voice complaining last February when her driveway wasn't cleared by 7 in the morning. I pulled out my phone and called my business partner, Marcus Chen. He answered on the second ring. "You get the letter?" I asked, just reading it now. "This is insane. They want us to plow during business hours only." "That's what it says. I'm heading over to the HOA office. Want to come? Wouldn't miss it." The Pine Ridge HOA office was located in a small building near the community entrance, designed to look like a miniature version of a Victorian mansion. Sharon had pushed for the renovation 2 years ago, spending nearly $80,000 of HOA funds to make it look prestigious. I parked my truck next to her white Lexus and walked inside. Sharon was at her desk, her blonde hair styled in that specific way that screamed, "I'd like to speak to your manager." She was 52, divorced, and had made the HOA her entire personality since moving into Pine Ridge 5 years ago. She looked up from her computer with an expression that managed to be both smug and annoyed. "Robert, I was expecting you might stop by. Sharon, we need to talk about this letter. A 9 to 5 restriction on snow removal, that's not realistic." She folded her hands on her desk. "The residents have been complaining about the noise. You start plowing at 4 in the morning, waking everyone up. It's disruptive to the peaceful enjoyment of their homes." "I start at 4 in the morning because people need to get to work by 7. They need their driveways and roads clear." That's literally the point of hiring a snow removal service. Well, the board voted unanimously. The new hours are effective immediately. She slid a copy of the HOA bylaws across her desk. Section 12, subsection 4 gives us the authority to regulate noise disturbances and commercial operations within the community. I didn't touch the papers. You realize this is going to be a problem when it actually snows, right? What am I supposed to do when we get a storm overnight? Wait until 9 in the morning while everyone's cars are buried. You'll adapt. Other communities manage just fine. No, Sharon, they don't. Other communities let their contractors work when it makes sense. This is going to create serious liability issues. She smiled that thin smile of hers. Well, those are the new rules. If you can't work within them, perhaps Pine Ridge needs to find a different contractor. That's when Marcus walked in, stamping snow off his boots. "Morning, Sharon. I see you're already making friends." "This is a private conversation," Sharon said. "Actually, I'm part owner of Mountain Peak, so it's very much my conversation too." Marcus pulled out his phone. "I've been checking, and there are only 3 licensed commercial snow removal companies in Boulder County that are bonded and insured for HOA work. We're one of them. Alpine Snow Services is the second, and they're fully booked with their existing contracts. Rocky Mountain Clearing is the third, and they lost their commercial permit last month after that accident in Netherlands. Sharon's expression flickered. That's not my concern. It should be, I said. Because we're the only contractor you have with a valid permit to operate in Pine Ridge. The permits are issued specifically by property, and they take 6 to 8 weeks to process through the county. If you terminate our contract, you won't have anyone legally able to clear snow here until mid-April at the earliest. Then I suggest you follow the new rules. I took a deep breath. This wasn't going how I'd hoped. Sharon, let me lay this out clearly. When that next storm hits, and it's going to hit this weekend according to the forecast, you're going to have 43 families calling you at 5 in the morning asking why their streets aren't plowed. What are you going to tell them? I'll tell them that their contractor isn't doing his job. No, you'll tell them that the HOA implemented restrictions that make it impossible for me to do my job. There's a difference. Sharon stood up. This meeting is over. You have your instructions. Follow them or face penalties. What penalties? She pulled out another document. The HOA can fine your company $500 per violation of community regulations. Each instance of snow removal outside designated hours will be considered a separate violation. Marcus laughed. You can't fine a contractor. We're not residents. The contract you signed gives the HOA the right to assess penalties for violations of community standards. I had our lawyer review it. I felt a cold weight in my stomach. She was right. The contract I'd signed 3 years ago, before Sharon had taken over as president, had a clause about adhering to HOA regulations. It had seemed like standard boilerplate at the time. Nobody had ever tried to use it before. We'll see about that, I said, heading for the door. Outside, Marcus looked at me with concern. What are you thinking? I'm thinking we follow her rules exactly. We plow between 9 and 5 just like she wants. Rob, that's professional suicide. Every resident is going to hate us. No, they're going to hate the HOA. And when they hate the HOA enough, Sharon gets voted out and we can go back to normal operations. That's a risky play. You have a better idea. He didn't. The storm rolled in that Saturday night, just like the Weather Service had predicted. It was a big one, the kind of late November system that dumps 15 inches before morning and makes every road in Colorado a hazard. My phone started ringing at 4:30 in the morning. The first call was from David Park, who lived on Aspen Court. Robert, why isn't my street plowed? I have to get to the hospital. I'm an ER doctor. People's lives are at stake. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. The HOA has restricted my operating hours. I'm not allowed to plow until 9 in the morning. That's insane. Who made that decision? Sharon Whitley and the board. I'm calling her right now. The next call came from Jennifer Martinez, then Tom Bradley, then Susan Wung. By 6 in the morning, I'd received 38 calls and I'd stopped answering. I knew what they wanted and I knew I couldn't help them. Not without facing those $500 fines that Sharon would absolutely enforce. At 8:45, I pulled out of my driveway with my crew of 4 trucks. We rolled into Pine Ridge at exactly 9 o'clock and started clearing. The snow was heavy and wet, the kind that packs down into ice if you don't get to it quickly. Several residents had already tried to shovel themselves out, creating uneven piles that made our job harder. Sharon was waiting at the corner of Birch Drive and Mountain View, standing next to her Lexus, which was predictably stuck. She flagged me down as I passed. Where have you been? My car is stuck and nobody's street is cleared. I rolled down my window. Following the rules you set. No snow removal before 9 in the morning. Don't be ridiculous. This is an emergency. Is it? Because your letter specifically said 9 to 5, no exceptions. You said I needed to adapt. Her face turned red. Clear my street right now or you're fired. Fire me then. But remember, you won't get another permitted contractor until spring, and I'll still expect to be paid for the work we've already done this season. I drove past her, clearing the main roads first. My crew worked systematically, but the damage was done. People had already left for work, getting stuck, calling tow trucks, missing important appointments. The community was in chaos and everyone knew exactly who to blame. My phone kept ringing. I finally answered when I saw it was my wife, Deanna. "Rob, are you okay? I'm seeing posts about Pine Ridge all over the neighborhood Facebook group." "Yeah, I'm fine, just following the HOA's new rules. People are furious. Someone started a petition to recall Sharon. How many signatures? Last I checked, 31. They need 36 for a special election." That was fast. The community had about 75 homes, and you needed 40% of households to petition for a recall vote. They were almost there already. I finished the main roads by noon and started on the residential streets. Each driveway took longer than usual because the snow had already been driven over, compacting it into dense layers. My crew was exhausted, and we were burning through fuel faster than normal. At 2 in the afternoon, Sharon called me directly. "We need to talk. Come back to the office." "I'm working. You wanted snow removed during business hours. That's what I'm doing." "Robert, please, this isn't working. No kidding. Can we discuss this like adults?" I sighed. "I'll be there at 5 when I'm done for the day." I arrived at the HOA office at 5:15, covered in snow and road salt. Sharon was there with 3 other board members, Patricia Donovan, William Hughes, and Carl Stevenson. They all looked tired and stressed. "Thank you for coming," Sharon said, her tone noticeably different from our last meeting. "Let's make this quick." "What do you want?" Patricia spoke up. She was in her 60s, a retired accountant who usually stayed quiet during board meetings. "We've received complaints, a lot of complaints. People missed work. Dr. Park couldn't get to the hospital. The Johnsons' elderly mother fell trying to shovel her own driveway." "Is she okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. "Sprained wrist, but she could have broken a hip." "Robert, we understand now that the restrictions were too severe." Sharon cut in. "We're willing to modify the hours, perhaps 6 in the morning to 8 in the evening." "That's still not realistic. Snow doesn't fall on a schedule. If a storm dumps snow at midnight, I need to clear it by morning commute." "That means starting at 3 or 4 in the morning sometimes." William, who owned a construction company and should have understood this from the beginning, nodded. "He's right. We were too restrictive." Sharon's jaw tightened. "We can't just let him make noise whenever he wants." The residents who complained about the noise have valid concerns too. "Which residents?" I asked. "Let me guess. Mrs. Whitley at 47 Mountain View Drive," Sharon's address. She didn't respond. Carl, who I'd always gotten along with, leaned forward. "Sharon, you have to admit that most of this came from your personal complaints. The rest of us didn't think it was a problem." "I brought it to the board and you all voted for it," Sharon snapped. "Because you told us multiple residents had complained and you pressured us," Patricia said. "But when I checked the records today, I found only 3 formal complaints ever filed about snow removal noise. 2 of them were from you and 1 was from your friend Margaret who moved away last year." Sharon stood up. "I don't have to listen to this." "Actually, you do," William said. "Patricia and I have been talking. We're calling for a board vote to rescind the new snow removal restrictions and return to the previous arrangement. You can't do that without my approval as president." "Yes, we can. It requires a majority of the board." "That's 3 out of 4, and you don't get to vote on it because you have a clear conflict of interest." I watched this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. I hadn't wanted to tear the board apart, but Sharon had left everyone with few options. "Fine," Sharon said coldly. "Vote however you want, but this isn't over." She grabbed her coat and walked out. Patricia looked at me apologetically. "We'll have the paperwork drawn up by Monday rescinding the restrictions. I'm sorry this happened, Robert. You've always done excellent work for us." "I appreciate that. But you should know that Sharon threatened to fine me $500 per violation if I worked outside her designated hours. Is that something the board is going to enforce?" "Absolutely not," William said firmly. "That clause was never meant to be used against contractors doing their jobs. We'll formally waive any penalties." We talked for another 20 minutes, working out the details. They'd send an email to all residents explaining the situation and confirming that snow removal would return to normal operations. They'd also clarify that the early morning work was necessary and appreciated, not a nuisance. I drove home that night feeling cautiously optimistic. Deanna had dinner waiting and I filled her in while we ate. "Think Sharon will let this go?" she asked. "Probably not. But the board seems to finally be standing up to her." I was right to be cautious. Monday morning, I received a certified letter from a law firm in downtown Boulder. Sharon had hired an attorney and was filing a personal lawsuit against me and Mountain Peak Snow Services for breach of contract, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She was seeking $50,000 in damages. I called my own lawyer, Richard Torres, who I'd used for business matters over the years. "This is harassment plain and simple," Richard said after reviewing the lawsuit. "She has no grounds for any of these claims. We'll file a motion to dismiss." "How long will that take?" "Could be a few months. The courts are backed up, but don't worry, I don't see any way she wins this." "Can I countersue for legal fees?" "Absolutely, and we should. This is clearly a frivolous lawsuit designed to intimidate you." The next week was tense. Sharon had apparently told several residents that I'd deliberately refused to plow the streets out of spite, conveniently leaving out the part about her imposed restrictions. Some people believed her, though most had already heard the full story through the neighborhood grapevine. The petition for Sharon's recall reached the required number of signatures. A special election was scheduled for mid-January, giving the community 6 weeks to campaign and vote on whether to remove her as president. Meanwhile, I had a business to run. We got 2 more significant snowstorms in December, and I made sure my crew was out there at 4 in the morning each time, clearing roads before the morning commute. Sharon called the sheriff's office twice to complain about the noise, but the deputies who showed up were sympathetic and explained that commercial snow removal was permitted at any hour under county ordinances. The second deputy, Officer Lisa Henderson, actually thanked me for clearing the roads. "Makes our job a lot easier when the streets are passable," she said. "Don't let that woman push you around." Christmas came and went. I sent holiday cards to all my clients, including the Pine Ridge HOA. Sharon returned hers with a nasty note about how I was destroying the community's peaceful character. In early January, 2 weeks before the recall election, things escalated. I arrived at Pine Ridge after a modest snowfall to find that someone had spray-painted profanities on one of my trucks that had been parked overnight near the community entrance. The words specifically accused me of being a noise terrorist and included threats. I called the Boulder County Sheriff's Office and filed a report. Officer Henderson came out to take photos and statements. "Any idea who might have done this?" she asked. "I have suspicions, but no proof." "Would those suspicions involve Sharon Whitley? I'm not going to speculate." She smiled grimly. "Smart. Let us investigate. We'll check if there are any security cameras in the area." As it turned out, the Pine Ridge entrance gate had a camera that covered part of the parking area. The HOA reluctantly provided the footage after the sheriff's office requested it. The video clearly showed Margaret Chen, Sharon's friend who had supposedly moved away last year, spray painting my truck at 2 in the morning while Sharon sat in her Lexus with the engine running, providing light. Officer Henderson called me 3 days later. We're pressing charges against both of them. Vandalism, criminal mischief, and conspiracy. Thought you'd want to know. Sharon was there, sitting in her car the whole time. She clearly knew what was happening and facilitated it. That makes her equally culpable under Colorado law. This changed everything. The recall election was now overshadowed by criminal charges against the HOA president. The story made the local news, with reporters calling me for comments. I kept my statements brief and professional, saying only that I was cooperating with law enforcement and hoped the matter would be resolved appropriately. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted 3-1, with Sharon dissenting, to place her on administrative leave pending the outcome of the criminal case. Patricia Donovan took over as interim president. Sharon's response was to double down. She showed up at the board meeting with her lawyer and threatened to sue the entire board for defamation and wrongful termination. Her attorney, a young guy named Bradley Morrison who looked fresh out of law school, tried to argue that Sharon was being railroaded without due process. William Hughes, who ran a construction company and clearly had experience dealing with lawyers, calmly explained that the bylaws allowed the board to suspend any officer facing criminal charges related to their HOA duties. Sharon had used her position to access the security footage and to be present at the community entrance at 2 in the morning, both of which related to her role as president. Bradley had no good counter to that. They left in a huff. The recall election happened as scheduled in mid-January. Despite Sharon's legal troubles, she refused to withdraw her name. The vote was 61-9 in favor of removal. Sharon had officially lost control of Pine Ridge. The criminal case moved forward quickly. Sharon and Margaret both faced misdemeanor vandalism charges. Richard Torres helped me file a civil lawsuit against both of them for the damages to my truck, which totaled $3,200 in repairs and lost work time. In February, Sharon and Margaret appeared in Boulder County Court before Judge Michael Patterson. Margaret pleaded guilty immediately, accepting a plea deal that included restitution, probation, and community service. Sharon insisted on fighting the charges. The trial took 2 days. The prosecution presented the security footage, which was damning. Sharon's lawyer tried to argue that she hadn't known what Margaret was doing, that she'd just been giving her friend a ride and happened to be parked there. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rachel Kim, destroyed that argument by pointing out that Sharon's headlights were aimed directly at my truck, that the spray painting took nearly 10 minutes during which Sharon never got out of her car to check on her friend, and that Sharon had specifically requested the security footage be deleted the next day, before she'd known I would file a police report. This wasn't a coincidence, Rachel told the jury of 6. This was a coordinated attack by a vindictive HOA president against a contractor who dared to stand up to her unreasonable demands. The defendant used her position of authority to facilitate vandalism and then attempted to cover it up by destroying evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Sharon guilty on all counts. Judge Patterson was not sympathetic during sentencing. Mrs. Whitley, you held a position of trust within your community. Rather than serving your neighbor's interests, you pursued a personal vendetta that culminated in criminal activity. You've shown no remorse and no understanding of how your actions harmed both Mr. Ortiz and the community you claim to serve. He sentenced her to 6 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay full restitution for the damage to my truck plus court costs. He also issued a restraining order preventing her from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of any of my business properties. The civil lawsuit settled out of court 2 weeks later. Sharon's homeowner's insurance refused to cover her actions, so she had to pay out of pocket. Between the restitution, my legal fees, and the settlement, she ended up paying nearly $15,000. The Pine Ridge HOA, now under Patricia's leadership, formally apologized to me in a letter sent to all residents. They offered to extend my contract for another 3 years at a 10% rate increase to compensate for the trouble I'd endured. Marcus and I discussed it over beers at the West End Tavern in downtown Boulder. "What do you think?" he asked. "Do we want to keep working with them after all this?" "The board isn't the problem. Sharon was the problem and she's gone. Most of the residents appreciate what we do. I think we should stay. You're more forgiving than I am. I'm practical. Pine Ridge is a good contract and the new board has been nothing but professional. Why walk away from that? We accepted the extended contract. The rest of that winter season was blissfully normal. We plowed when it snowed, residents thanked us, and nobody complained about early morning noise. Sharon tried one last move in March. She filed an appeal of her criminal conviction, arguing that the evidence had been improperly obtained. The appeals court rejected it in a terse ruling that essentially said she'd waived her rights when she'd voluntarily provided the security footage to law enforcement. She put her house up for sale in April and moved out of Pine Ridge by the end of May. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd relocated to Fort Collins, about an hour north. Good riddance. The story could have ended there, but there was one more twist that summer. In July, I received a call from the city attorney's office in Fort Collins. An HOA there, Ridgemont Hills, was accusing me of fraudulent business practices and demanding that the city revoke any permits I might hold to work in their jurisdiction. "I don't work in Fort Collins," I told the city attorney, a man named George Whitman. "I've never even bid on a contract up there." "That's what I thought. Can you send me your business records showing all your current contracts?" I sent over everything. George called back 2 days later, laughing. "You're not going to believe this. The HOA president at Ridgemont Hills is Sharon Whitley. She moved into the community 2 months ago, got herself elected president within 3 weeks, and immediately started making accusations against you. She claimed you damaged property at their community and failed to fulfill contracts. None of which is true because I've never worked there." "Exactly. I explained that to her quite clearly. I also explained that filing false complaints with the city attorney's office is a serious matter and that she could face charges for making fraudulent statements." "What did she say?" "She hung up on me. But I've made a note in our system that any future complaints from her should be thoroughly verified before we take action. Thought you should know she's still got it out for you." I thanked George and immediately called Richard Torres to update him. "Can we do anything about this?" "We could file for a broader restraining order," Richard said. "But honestly, she's making herself look crazy. The more she does this, the more she discredits herself. I document everything but otherwise ignore her unless she does something actionable." That was frustrating advice, but probably correct. Sharon had become her own worst enemy. The real vindication came that September when the local news ran a feature story about small business owners who'd faced harassment from HOAs. They interviewed me, along with 2 other contractors who dealt with similar situations. The reporter, Kevin Huang, did an excellent job presenting the facts and showing how HOAs sometimes overstep their authority. The story went semi-viral online, getting picked up by regional news outlets, and even making it onto a few national morning shows as a human interest piece. My business phone rang off the hook for weeks with new clients who said they'd seen the story and wanted to work with someone who stood up for themselves. Mountain Peak Snow Services grew by 40% over the next year. We added 3 more trucks and hired 8 new employees. Marcus and I opened a second office in Longmont to handle increased demand in the northern part of the county. Pine Ridge remained one of our best clients. Patricia Donovan served 2 years as HOA president before stepping down, and the board elected David Park, the ER doctor who'd been one of the first to complain about Sharon's ridiculous restrictions. David was everything Sharon hadn't been: reasonable, communicative, and focused on actually serving the community's needs. One day in November, almost exactly 2 years after Sharon's initial letter restricting my hours, David called me to chat about the upcoming winter season. "I just want you to know how much the community appreciates your work," he said. "We had a board meeting last night, and someone brought up the whole situation with Sharon. It's amazing to look back and realize how much better things have been since we got rid of those nonsense restrictions." "I appreciate that, David. You've got a great community there. We try. Hey, speaking of which, we're having a neighborhood BBQ this weekend. You and your family should come. Let people thank you in person." Diana and I attended the BBQ with our kids. It was a beautiful autumn day, warm sun and clear skies, the mountains visible in the distance with their first dusting of snow. Residents came up to shake my hand, thank me for my work, and share their own stories about dealing with Sharon's reign of terror. Jennifer Martinez, who had 3 kids and worked as a nurse, pulled me aside. "I never got to properly thank you. That morning when you couldn't plow early, I missed my shift. But you know what? That inconvenience was worth it because it finally opened everyone's eyes to how toxic Sharon was. You did us a favor by standing your ground." Tom Bradley, a software engineer who worked from home, agreed. "She was making everyone miserable with her constant rules and fines. You were just the catalyst that got us all to finally do something about it." As the sun set and families packed up their grills and folding chairs, I stood with Marcus looking out at Pine Ridge. It was a beautiful community, well-maintained homes with mature trees and mountain views that never got old. "Think we'll ever deal with another Sharon?" Marcus asked. "Probably. There's always someone who thinks being on an HOA board means being a dictator. But now we know how to handle it. Stand your ground, know your rights, and let the community see who's really causing the problems." Words to live by. We packed up and headed home. Deanna fell asleep in the passenger seat, tired from chasing our kids around all afternoon. I drove through quiet streets, past neighborhoods lit by porch lights and street lamps, thinking about how a simple dispute over snow removal hours had turned into a 2-year saga that ended with criminal charges, lawsuits, and ultimately positive change. The first major snow of the season hit 3 weeks later, a massive storm that dropped 18 inches overnight. I was out at 3 in the morning with my crew, clearing roads so people could get to work safely. When we rolled into Pine Ridge at 3:45, I half expected someone to complain about the noise. Instead, I saw lights turning on in houses, people looking out their windows and waving thank you. David Park, who had an early shift at the hospital, stopped as he was getting into his car and gave me a thumbs up. This was why I did the work. Not for the money, though that was good. Not for the recognition, though that was nice. I did it Because when a major storm hit and everyone else was warm in their beds, my crew and I were out there making sure people could get to work, to the hospital, to wherever they needed to be. Sharon Whitley had tried to stop that. She tried to impose arbitrary rules that would have made it impossible for me to do my job effectively. And in the end, all she'd accomplished was getting herself kicked out of the community, convicted of a crime, and becoming a cautionary tale about what happens when personal ego trumps common sense. The snow kept falling all through December and January. We worked long hours, sometimes around the clock during major storms. Every time I drove through Pine Ridge at 4 in the morning, my plow blade scraping asphalt and throwing snow into neat banks along the curb, I thought about that first letter with its absurd restrictions. In February, I got a call from George Whitman in Fort Collins. Thought you'd want to know that Sharon Whitley resigned from the Ridgemont Hills HOA board. Apparently, she tried to implement some new rules about lawn maintenance schedules, and the residents revolted. She's been voted off the board and is reportedly putting her house up for sale again. Where's she moving this time? Not sure. Somewhere far away, hopefully. I'll drink to that. Spring came, as it always does in Colorado, with wildly fluctuating temperatures and occasional late-season snow. My business stayed busy with spring cleanup contracts and landscaping work. Pine Ridge hired us for their annual spring street maintenance, which included repairing any damage from snow plows and salting operations. One afternoon in April, I was supervising the crack ceiling work when Patricia Donovan walked over. She'd stayed on the HOA board even after stepping down as president. "Robert, can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Sure." "Why didn't you just quit when Sharon implemented those restrictions? Most contractors would have walked away rather than deal with the hassle." I thought about it for a moment. Because it wasn't right. I had a valid contract, I was doing good work, and my crew depends on this income. Sharon was trying to bully me into walking away, and I don't respond well to bullies. Plus, I knew that if I stood my ground, eventually the community would see what was really happening. You gambled that we'd side with you over her. I gambled that people would side with common sense and good service over someone on a power trip. Fortunately, I was right. Patricia smiled. "We're lucky to have you, not just because you're good at your job, but because you showed us that we didn't have to put up with Sharon's behavior." A lot of us had been intimidated by her for years. Watching you stand up to her gave the rest of us courage to do the same. That conversation stuck with me. I hadn't thought of it that way, but Patricia was right. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about you. It's about showing other people that they don't have to accept unreasonable behavior either. The years rolled on. Mountain Peak Snow Services continued to grow. We expanded into summer landscaping and property maintenance, diversifying the business so we weren't solely dependent on winter work. We hired more staff, bought more equipment, and took on larger contracts. Pine Ridge remained a cornerstone client. David Park served 3 years as HOA president before passing the role to Susan Wung, who was equally reasonable and professional. The community thrived under leadership that focused on maintaining property values and fostering good relationships with residents rather than imposing arbitrary rules. I never heard from Sharon Whitley again after that last call from George. Occasionally, I'd wonder what happened to her, whether she learned anything from the experience or just moved on to torment some other community. Probably the latter, if I'm being honest, but that wasn't my problem anymore. My problem, if you could call it that, was managing a successful business and serving clients who appreciated our work. Deanna and I built a good life. Our kids grew up watching their dad run an honest business that treated people fairly and stood up for what was right. One snowy evening, about 5 years after the whole Sharon situation started, I was sitting in my office catching up on paperwork. Marcus stuck his head in. "Hey, remember that story Kevin Huang did about us and the HOA drama?" "Yeah, why?" He just emailed. "Wants to do a follow-up piece about where we are now, how the business has grown, what happened with Pine Ridge. You interested?" "Sure, why not? It's a good story." Kevin came out the next week and spent a full day with us, riding along on service calls and interviewing clients. When the story ran, it was even better than the first one. He framed it as a success story about standing up to unreasonable authority and how integrity in business pays off in the long run. The Pine Ridge HOA got highlighted as an example of how communities could change for the better when residents demanded accountability from their leadership. Kevin even interviewed David Park and several other residents who talked about how much better things were without Sharon's constant interference. The story ended with a quote from me that I was pretty proud of. "At the end of the day, you have to do what's right, even when it's difficult." HOAs serve an important purpose, but they work best when they remember they exist to serve the community, not control it. When board members lose sight of that, residents and contractors need to speak up. Otherwise, nothing ever changes. That quote got shared around on social media, picked up by HOA reform groups, and even cited in a few legal cases involving contractor disputes. I got calls from people across the country asking for advice on dealing with their own HOA problems. I helped where I could, always giving the same basic advice. Document everything, know your rights, stay professional, and don't back down when you're in the right. Most of the time, unreasonable people will either back down when confronted or expose themselves so thoroughly that others have no choice but to intervene. Looking back on the whole experience, I wouldn't change much. Sure, it was stressful. Yes, there were moments when I wondered if standing my ground was worth the hassle. But ultimately, fighting back against Sharon's arbitrary restrictions led to positive changes not just for my business, but for the entire Pine Ridge community. The snow removal hours dispute was really about something bigger: whether people in positions of minor authority could abuse that power without consequences. Sharon thought she could. She was wrong. And that's a lesson worth learning, even if it took criminal charges and public humiliation for her to learn it. These days, when I train new employees at Mountain Peak, I tell them Sharon's story as a cautionary tale. Not about difficult clients, but about why we always maintain our professionalism and integrity, even when dealing with unreasonable people. Because at the end of the day, you can't control how others act. You can only control how you respond. And sometimes, responding with patience, documentation, and unwavering commitment to doing the right thing is enough to change everything. The snow still falls every winter in Boulder. The mountains still loom beautiful and imposing against the western sky. And when those big storms roll in at 2 in the morning, I'm still out there with my crew, clearing roads so people can live their lives safely and normally. That's what I do. That's what Sharon tried to stop, and that's why in the end she lost. Because you can't fight reality with arbitrary rules. Snow doesn't care about HOA restrictions or convenient schedules. It falls when it falls, and someone has to clear it at whatever hour makes sense. For 15 years, that someone has been me, and if I've learned anything from the Sharon Whitley saga, it's that good work and good character eventually win out over petty tyranny. Pine Ridge taught me that lesson. And every winter morning when I fire up my truck at 3 a.m. and head out into the dark, snowy streets, I remember it. I remember why I do this work, who I do it for, And what happens when you stand your ground against people who think their authority makes them untouchable? The best part: I'm still the contractor with the only valid permit for Pine Ridge. And now, nobody's trying to tell me when I can use it.